First of all, thanks very much to Exposure OLAS for sponsoring this race. As a jog member, you can get 25% discount on their products. They make some very good, high quality head torches and safety equipment. Also, as a jog member, you can get a 20% discount on Predict Wind membership as well. So Predict Wind is what we're going to use for this briefing. It's a very good package. I think it's probably the best value routing package you can get on the market at the moment. Just so you'll know, as a starting point, there'll be a drinks reception at 1100 BST on the Sunday morning on the pontoons once we all arrive in Cherbourg. There's obviously, you'll have seen all the stuff about arrival and departure from France in relation to customs and border control. We'll just have a chat about that at the end. But making a start on the synoptic weather, again, much like last race weekend, it's going to be quite challenging, principally due to a high pressure system sitting over the UK that's going to bring light and variable winds to the English Channel. So I'm just going to play the synoptic forecast forward using the UKMO model. So as we see, big high pressure sat over the UK, bit of a hole in the channel, and then by sort of 4 o'clock Saturday afternoon, there's this low pressure system here, just starting to push over sort of Scotland, Northern Ireland and Northern England. It's not really having much effect at all on our neck of the woods. And you see the high pressure is pretty dominant all the way into Monday, when we'll all hopefully be back home. So it's going to be quite a challenging race, especially towards the Cherbourg Peninsula, where the tide gets a bit stronger, and we really need to be thinking about how we're going to position ourselves for the finish, depending on what the tide's doing in that particular moment. I'll just show you what the wind map looks like at the synoptic level, just playing that from about now, just playing it forwards. So we'll just zoom in a bit. So as you can see, there's a big wind hole stretching between Weymouth and the Isle of Wight. And that feature there is going to move about a bit with some wind pushing in tonight and tomorrow morning from the northeast. However, we then have a large wind hole basically coming off the UK mainland, pushing into the channel, bringing the light and variable winds, especially north of the Cherbourg Peninsula, where, you know, a little bit further north, you've got westerly winds, a little bit further south, you've got northeasterly winds, and then easterly winds. So it's gonna be a real challenge to make the finish line. The slowest routing model we looked at so far was saying finish about 2 o'clock in the afternoon on Sunday. So hopefully that doesn't come to pass. In terms of cloud, I think it'll be quite cloudy, much like today if anybody's been outside. So you're looking at pretty full cloud cover, but no real rain or sort of adverse weather. Apologies, I think the weather model's just literally updated just as we were speaking then, which is why the screen went like that. It's looking a bit colder than it was last weekend, maybe 10 to 11 degrees in the daytime. It's not getting much colder than that though at night, which is good because it was pretty cold in the last race. Although going downwind, it might not be so painful. Taking an overview of the course. So our usual start line off Gurnard. When we're starting between 10 and 10:30, the tide inshore should be ebbing already, but probably not far offshore. Not far offshore, the tide will be still in flood. So there'll be a choice to make on the start line, whether you position yourself more inshore or offshore. The advantage being probably further offshore, particularly for the early starts, is that you've got more opportunity to get over to the mainland side, which I think you'll find better wind on the mainland side than you will on the island side, even though the tide is turned on the island side first. Coming down the Solent, there's obviously deep water in the middle and shallow water either side, but I do think the wind on the island side will be much worse. By the time we're all approaching sconce, the tide should have turned fully across the course, I think. And generally the best tide on the ebb is to be found near sconce. My main advice would be look at the water, and where the water is most disturbed is where you're going to find the best tide. then coming down the Needles Channel, generally the best ebb tide is on the north side of the channel. I like to draw a line from sort of the buoys, and then so from the Cardinal and then all the red buoys down the Needles Channel. That's generally where the best tide is. But if it's light, like it is tomorrow, you might be able to see the disturbed water will tell you where to be. Coming round the Needles, so the course says Needles and obstructions, so you know, you can't go through the gaps if you wanted to. Not that I advise anyone to. But once you clear the Needles, there's really no point, in my opinion, in sailing further west. I think everybody generally wants to be trying to get in as far south as quickly as possible, without trying to be too clever, simply because I think it's almost impossible to predict what direction the wind's going to be coming from at any particular point during Saturday daytime, because it is so variable. So we'll be heading south, probably getting pushed quite far to the east and west as the tide ebbs and floods. And then the key part will be approaching the finish and positioning ourselves up tide of the finish line so that we can try and finish on whichever tide we're facing at the time. Now, I know there's probably quite a few people who've done this race before and have ended up spending 6 or 12 hours getting caught out by the tide and getting pushed the wrong way, especially in light downwind conditions. So it's going to be challenging to finish properly for some of us. But the main thing is just try and position yourself up tide and make that finish line on the planned tide that you think you're going to make it. With that, I'd like to hand over to Will, who's going to look at the legs in detail.
Okay, thank you very much. So starting with the leg and the Solent, I think sort of it's already been alluded to, but the key thing is going to be really important to keep an eye on the tide and the tide turn. So if you have a method or any way of displaying cog, SOG versus heading and boat speed, so you can track whether you've got positive or negative, because 10, 15 minutes either way is within the margin of error for tidal books, tidal heights. Especially with a high pressure, it's likely to be a little bit later. So again, keeping an eye on looking at the marks as you come into the start, especially it's probably going to be different for strategies between whether you're starting in class 3 at 10 or class 1 at 10:30. So if I was starting in class 3, I'd be looking for one of the edges to stay in the turn tide. I agree with Will that off Gurnard is likely to be light with a northeasterly. Having said that, we did the Great Escape race down to Bridge in the northeasterly, and there was a weird band of breeze off Gurnard. So it's worth keeping your eyes out the boat and picking a shore and going for it. When you sort of get down to the 10:30 class 1, I would expect it to be turned pretty much across the course. So at that point, well, certainly within the first half hour of the race. So at that point, I'd be looking more wind bands, trying to make sure you stay in the breeze, keep clean air, and then work your way down the Solent. It's the other thing to bear in mind is as the tide builds, the apparent wind is going to drop. So given that some of the forecasts are only saying 6 to 8 knots to start with, it could be quite a slow drip down the Solent, even with the tide width, and it's spring tide, so there's going to be a lot of tide. I think it's also worth keeping an eye out and making sure you stay reasonably up tide of the Hurst Gap, because what you don't want to be doing is find yourself struggling to make it sort of across the tide to get round either corner, either Hurst or Sconce. As mentioned before, best tide at Sconce and then the north edge of the Needles Channel. In a northeasterly, I would be very cautious about all the bays around the Needles, both north and south, because the big cliffs there are likely to give you very big wind holes. I think sort of for the Solent, that's probably everything. I think just another warning caution is probably, already mentioned, but watch out for big wind holes and the tide ending up tide of an obstacle and having problems. Crossing the channel is going to be a very interesting experience. If you believe some forecasts, and it was stronger earlier in the week, there is more pressure southeast, but it's not in every model, and that has got less as the week's gone on. So I think is sort of coming back to what the other Will said, trying to focus on getting as far south as possible. If the hole and the sort of the pressure and the model moving together is later than forecast, and that comes up occasionally in some of the routings I've run this week, you might be able to make it across before, but I don't know if anything in the fleet is fast enough to make it. And certainly in these slower boats, it's going to be a challenge. So I would expect sort of, try and get as far south as you can in the northeasterly. Again, going back to the tide, with the tide pushing west, that's going to really kill the apparent and make it very difficult to get east. As you can see on some of these models, if just for example, looking at the green line, I would expect that to almost be a boat almost drifting a little bit on the tide. It's hard to tell, and certainly some of the big curve out on the yellow, I think that's the UK Met Office model, that's a boat drifting east on the tide. The one advantage when the tide does turn to the east is it is going to improve your apparent, and hopefully give you that, combined with the actual wind, might give you something. But as you can see, until you can get through that hole, it's going to be a very painful experience. I think the other thing, just as a warning for note with all the routings, is all the routings assume that even in 2-3 knots of wind, your boat still moves. It might only be a knot or two, but it still moves according to the model. Whereas we all know that once you add a little bit of swell to it, you're not going to be moving. So I'm sounding quite pessimistic here, but I think it's just a question of keeping the boat moving, keeping the boat going. Tidally, with the being a route based south to Cherbourg, I think just drift east and west on the tide and just try and keep putting that south in. It is worth noting it does run slightly southwest northeast. It's not pure east west, but I don't think any of it is going to be of a big enough negative to start talking about anchoring or anything like that. Obviously, we're also in the channel, so that's a lot of line, and I've done it once or twice, and it's never actually paid, because you've ended up, you can't react when you get some breeze in. So I think work your way south as best you can, and then sort of hopefully maybe a little bit more southeast. And then I think sort of moving towards Cherbourg, again, think about tide and wind. So in the classic southwesterly, there's always a giant hole off Cherbourg. The cliffs and hills behind Cherbourg are pretty high. I don't actually have the numbers in front of me, but I would expect even in a northeasterly, there to be quite a bit of a hole as the wind tries to rise up over the hills behind Cherbourg. And if it's gone east or things, I would expect it's going around the corners. So it will be doing some very weird, fluky things as you come into the finish. As Will said, try and make sure you are up tide. The challenge with that is going to be making sure that you know which side of the tide you're going to be, because obviously it's going to be quite hard to put the east-west you need in when you don't know your arrival times. So that's sort of my thoughts on the lake. And when we get to one of these weather briefings, I'm going to be able to give a definitive answer. But we've done 3 or 4 so far, and it's always been light and fluky, and I've not been able to give a definitive answer. And I'm afraid it's going to be another one of those. I'm just try and keep the boat going, try and keep it moving south, and then we'll see what time we get down there.
Thanks very much, Will. Just quickly, because I didn't actually show it earlier, to recap what the finish line is. It's in the SIs. There's a very good picture in the SIs of the finish line, but essentially it's a line between the lighthouse on the end of the jetty and the red can finishing in a northwest to southeast direction, just to recap there. So a couple of just sailing instruction highlights. Key one again is the drinks party, so that's 1100 BST, so UK time, or 1200 French time on the Sunday on the pontoons. Before we start, don't forget to go through the ID gate showing your flare pack and your sail numbers. Leading yachts, if they could please text the race officer or call Jog 1 on VHF 72 so the the finish line VHF channel is different to the start one, which is worth knowing. Please take your own finishing time, as there'll be no finish line team in place. The time limit is 23:59 on Sunday. Hopefully none of us are still there, but you never can tell with this weather. If retiring or withdrawing, please let the race officer know by mobile or VHF, whichever VHF channel you're nearer the start of a finish, essentially. It's likely to be mobile though, if we're being realistic. Don't forget, so some of the admin stuff now, very important. Now we have Brexited, that we don't just sail into France like we used to, walk up the pontoon and go for a beer. There's now a little bit more formality to it. So first of all, as you would normally, please take all your yacht's papers. So that's insurance, certificates of registry if you have it, evidence of VAT payments, that type of thing. Jog Today put out a really good guide, which is worth going to look at. It came into you via the WhatsApp group for this race. So if you haven't joined the WhatsApp group, it's really worth joining just to look at that guidance. We'll also need to provide a arrival and departure report to both the UK and the French authorities. So again, that's in the email that's been sent today and in the WhatsApp. So with the UK side, you let them know when you've left. So I sent my departure report earlier this afternoon, and I've actually sent my arrival report to Cherbourg already. And I got a funny email from them, which I translated into English, and it said, your report wasn't attached when it was. So I don't know what to make of that, but I've sent it and I think I've done my duty. And then for me personally, I've just set my arrival back in the UK and my departure from France reports just there in my draft emails on my phone. So I can just send them whenever I like. And I just picked an arbitrary time, to be honest, for both of those. The other thing is COVID. Everybody needs to provide evidence of COVID vaccination. Again, if you're not vaccinated, there's more detailed instructions in the jog brief about that. Does anybody have any questions at this point? Please feel free to ask in the Q&A if you do. If anybody is writing a question, I just thought we'd talk very briefly about the return journey home, because we're all going to have to make it. Looking at the weather, to be honest, it's much of a muchness. There's maybe actually a bit more wind on Sunday afternoon, evening into Monday, so you might be able to sail for a good chunk of it. But then I think nearing the UK coast, we're going to end up probably motor sailing if we want to get home in a reasonable time. So it's probably worth everybody making sure they take lots of fuel with them. I remember last time I was in Cherbourg, there's a very good self-service fuel pontoon you can use, and just top up your tank and give yourself an easy life, rather than trying to save a bit of weight, would be my opinion on the way home. Question in the Q&A. Is the club bar open on Sunday as the website suggests? That is a very good question. I think it will be open based on the information I got today from Jog in the email about the French side of things. Hopefully it is, although I think we'll just have to wait and see. Maybe take some beer with you. Where it says on the next question, where it says on the French form address town, do they need the full address of each person? I did put the full address of each of my crew in, but there's only 2 of us, so it was very easy for me. I imagine, just to be on the safe side, just stick it in there. Thank you for those questions. Any more on the question front? No, well, Will and I are going to hang around for a few more minutes just to answer any questions. Sorry, we can provide a more definitive answer on how to route tomorrow's race. I think we're all going to have quite a tough time with the wind. The models are saying completely different things, and so there's very little you can do on the routing front, I think, except just sailing as best you can in the wind as you find it. And I've actually said that every single briefing we've done so far. So maybe that is the best advice.
As I said, one of these times we'll have a nice, simple weather forecast that'll be really obvious, go east or go west or go in a straight line. But so far this year is proven to be an interesting one.
Right, well, thanks very much to everybody for their time. Just final thought, I'm going to have another double check of the jog advice on going to France, just to make sure all the paperwork's in order. And I'd just encourage everybody to do the same, and then go and have a beer and enjoy your evening. And definitely don't forget your passport as well.
Thank you very much, everyone. Have a good evening.
Thank you very much.